Welcome to the Silent Empires. Tonight, let your mind drift into the shadowy world of Frank Nitti, the infamous enforcer who ruled the Chicago underworld when the city never slept. As you close your eyes, imagine the whispers of power, loyalty, and betrayal carried through the streets. Before we begin, drop your city and the time you're listening in the comments. I love seeing where everyone's tuning in from. And if you enjoy sleeping stories of gangsters and empires long gone, hit that subscribe button and join our growing family. Now, settle in. The night is waiting. He walked out into the chill before sunrise, hat low, coat collar up, streets empty except for the soft rattle of a freight car far off. He wasn't the loudest man in any room. He carried himself like someone who had learned long ago that quiet was safer than talk. Neighbors knew him as a polite fellow from the block, a man who tipped the mailman and helped carry groceries. Papers knew a different name. Cameras waited for that name because it turned ordinary pages into headlines. Yet beneath the headlines there was a human life. A boy from a small Italian town who crossed an ocean, worked with his hands, and learned how the city's shadows ran on money and nerve. If you want to understand that life, the choices that led to wealth, fear, and the weight that finally settled on his shoulders, you need to start far away from the tracks and the cameras. Back when his world was a crowded tenement, and the dream was just staying one step ahead of hunger. He began in Angry, a town that smells of lemons and damp earth when the rain comes, a place of stone houses and tight lanes. Work was scarce, opportunities thinner than a bad harvest. Families traded stories of America like treasure maps, streets where a man could work without a landlord tying a knot around his throat, where you could save enough to bring over your brother, your cousin, maybe even buy a small house someday. As a child, he learned restraint. Listen more than you speak. Keep your hands steady. Remember who sits where at the table. That sort of skill seems small until you need to read a room and leave without leaving a mark. When the ship crossed the Atlantic and the harbor opened wide, he joined a tide of people who carried new names in their mouths and old worries in their pockets. New York swallowed families whole and asked them to keep moving. He spent his first years learning English one clipped sentence at a time, discovering how bustling blocks could also be a sanctuary if you shared a language and a Sunday dinner. He swept floors, shined shoes, and took up barbering. A good barber hears everything. You trade a clean cut for gossip, complaints, and news who owes who. Which officer took a little something last week? Which corner stays quiet? Where a freighter docks after midnight? None of that makes a criminal. It makes a watcher. As he grew into his coat, he turned from simple trades to side work that paid better. Police records from that period list small arrests, petty larceny, carrying a weapon without permission, suspicion of fencing jewelry. Charges were often dropped, sometimes ending in short stints behind bars. The pattern mattered more than the details. He was learning what moved money in a city that pretended certain vices didn't exist while relying on them every payday. He discovered that people paid not just for the service wine, cards, a place to forget, but for protection from the sudden cold blast of attention from authorities. He wasn't a street corner prowler. He wanted to be the person who knew the route, who never raised his voice because the arrangement worked quietly if everyone stayed in their lane. Chicago pulled him west like a magnet. By the mid-1910s, it offered steady work in Italian neighborhoods around Taylor Street and the near West Side. He cut hair in a little shop, kept a neat apron, cashed small checks of trust, introductions to men who ran the neighborhood's hidden economy. That world was older than prohibition gambling parlors, brothels, and betting slips, but the real fortunes arrived with a law meant to make the country sober. When the 18th Amendment went into effect in 1920, liquor didn't disappear. It went backstage and demanded new logistics, import routes, storage, trucks, and a system to keep newspapers looking the other way. The men who built those systems were the ones who grew powerful. He connected with the organization run first by Johnny Torrio and then by Al Capone, a network that preferred to think of itself as a business. Out loud, they said they sold goods and services. Everyone understood the euphemism. He handled distribution chains, made sure shipments reached speakeasies, arranged drivers and boats, negotiated rates, and oversaw the flow of cash up the ladder. He became known for reliability rather than public menace. If a shipment vanished, he found out why and made sure it didn't happen again. If a patrolman poked around where he shouldn't, someone higher up received a quiet visit from a lawyer or a ward boss who reminded him how elections were paid for. That period dirtied a lot of hands in Chicago. Politicians, union stewards, precinct captains, even police, many cooperated, some reluctantly, some eagerly. He fit the pattern of the quiet operator whose power grew because he never craved the spotlight. He dressed well, kept hours like a businessman, and home felt like a separate world from the rooms where deals were made. He married, kept family life as sheltered as possible, and learned that the safest way to be notorious was to avoid any boast. People called him the Enforcer, but the nickname misleads as much as it reveals. He could be hard when necessary, yes, but he rarely needed to bark orders. He set prices, ensured payments, and delegated anything loud to people further down the line. Bootlegging revenues made the outfit into an enterprise. Warehouses hummed. Trucks pulled out at dawn with routes that changed every week. Couriers knew only their piece of the plan. A bookkeeper tracked cash with careful ledgers. The men at the top handled disputes like executive sit-downs where territory and percentages were divided. Violence was part of that era, but many problems were solved with numbers and threats that stayed verbal. He was good at that. He understood how to make the cost of defiance higher than the price of agreement, without turning every disagreement into a catastrophic feud. Winters in those years were especially cold, or so the papers liked to say. What mattered was the relentless churn. Arrests here and there, raids that netted barrels and headlines, corruption scandals that toppled minor officials. Through it all, he kept distribution running, extending the network beyond city limits, building ties to suppliers in other states, adding layers between himself and risky activity. The higher a man climbed, the more insulation he wanted. He climbed. The street Valentine's Day killings in 1929 reshaped public perception of everything connected to the outfit. His name wasn't stamped on that atrocity, and his work always tilted toward finance and logistics, rather than shock tactics. Still, the fallout pressed down on everyone in the organization. Newspapers howled for reform. The federal government leaned harder on tax cases, and local judges felt more watched than ever. The outfit responded by getting even more disciplined. Fewer open threats, more lawyers, more caution. He adapted easily to this colder climate. He liked clean desks and precise meetings. He preferred outcomes that didn't need brooms. The government learned from its failures. Agents began to follow ledgers instead of rum runners. If you couldn't tie a man to a shipment, you could tie him to unpaid taxes. The shift produced results. In 1931, while the public cheered as a notorious boss went down on tax evasion, prosecutors delivered more papers to lieutenants whose income never made sense if you compared their stated jobs with their actual lifestyle. He was among them. He faced federal counts linked to unreported income from the middle years of Prohibition. Defending such a case meant trying to prove that cash had come legally, a task that mocked the very rules his world relied on. He took a path often chosen then, a plea that trimmed exposure, a term behind bars, a fine. It wasn't a long sentence by modern standards, but it changed him. Confinement taught him what walls could do to a mind. The man who paced rooms and sat in quiet corners now counted days more than dollars. Those close to him would later say he carried a private dread of closed spaces after that, a fear that looked like stubbornness when he discussed any future risk. When he walked out on parole, he looked thinner, and he measured time differently. Chicago shifted again while he adjusted to life on the outside. The top boss was gone to federal penitentiaries. The newspapers had fewer sensational headlines to feed on, and the city, still brisk with graft, was in the middle of a political realignment. He returned to his place within the outfit, still trusted, perhaps more cautious, definitely more aware that government pressure rarely loosened once it found a target. He resumed meetings, the quiet lunches with lawyers, the small smiles with old allies who understood that attention was now worse than ever. Everyone tried to keep a lower profile. Then came a day in December 1932 that threw him into a blaze of attention he never wanted. Summoned to the central station for questioning, he arrived in a suit and hat, expecting routine pressure and some show of authority. What happened in those next moments became a tangle of claims. Shots rang out inside official walls. He was wounded. An officer was hurt. Early accounts painted him as the aggressor, a man who drew a weapon in a government building. Later examinations raised doubts, powder burns, angles that didn't match the original story. whispers that someone wanted him dead to satisfy political promises. Trials and hearings followed. He recovered. The most serious charges against him tied to that incident evaporated. The city moved on. But he didn't forget. You don't forget something like that. You learn exactly how fragile your place is, not just on the street, but in rooms where the law is supposed to be the law. By then, prohibition was dying. Repeal arrived in December 1933 and dried up a fountain that had soaked the outfit's books for over a decade. Many gangs all over the country collapsed as their main product went legal. The Chicago organization, stripped of its most famous name and stripped of its perfect cash cow, didn't collapse. It adapted. The men behind the scenes pivoted toward unions and businesses where leverage could be sold. Trucking, building trades, cleaning and dyeing, and later, entertainment. He was exactly the kind of manager needed for a transition like that. He didn't need notoriety. He needed relationships. He sat with labor figures, scheduled meetings with studios through trusted intermediaries, and prepared the next phase. Swapping crates of contraband for influence over payrolls and production schedules. Inside the outfit, his stature grew in public, while others guided the deepest strategy. Colleagues later said he was the face the outside world recognized, the man reporters could name, while partners like Paul Ricca and Tony Accardo shaped the broader map. The arrangement suited him. He didn't relish improv. He liked deals built on paper and handshakes with people who understood what a promise meant in that world. He remained careful, almost formal in manner, and kept home life insulated. A house in Riverside let him be a neighbor, a homeowner, a regular customer at small storefronts who overpaid as a silent thank you for discretion. He could be warm in private. He was not a bombastic storyteller. He talked when talk was required and left promptly when it wasn't. With liquor profits fading, labor racketeering became the backbone of the outfit's revenues. He helped shape the approach. The core idea was simple enough. If you could influence who worked and when, you could shape how much employers paid to avoid disruption. That influence flowed through unions. Some unions were honest, many were vulnerable, and a few were steered by men who treated dues as a personal fund. It wasn't just about shaking people down. It was about harnessing the machinery of schedules, contracts, and signatures. He proved adept at that kind of leverage. He wasn't the public negotiator. He shepherded the process, matching the right emissary to the right industry, keeping names out of the papers, ensuring that money returned in steady streams instead of risky piles. His life in those mid-1930s years looked ordinary on the surface. He went to restaurants, nodded politely at church festivals, and hosted family on Sundays. He also kept a calendar of meetings with associates whose nicknames never appeared in the society pages. He dealt in favors, arranging a job for a friend's nephew, smoothing a rough patch with a ward office, reminding a small business owner that cooperation had benefits. All of that sustained the outfit's network across neighborhoods and downtown. He left the loud threats to men who liked hearing themselves talk. He pursued influence that didn't need a bullhorn, yet he was never in the clear. Federal agents still kept a file on him. Local reporters still saw him as a symbol of Chicago's underworld, tidy and mannered on the outside, connected to forces that bent commerce and fear on the inside. He took precautions. He changed routines. He didn't drive the same route every day. He preferred short meetings to long ones. He avoided rooms with no secondary exit. Those habits came from experience more than superstition. He knew exactly what thin ice sounded like when it groaned underfoot. By the end of the decade, attention shifted west to an industry that printed dreams for a living. Organized labor in the film business offered a lever big enough to move mountains. If a studio faced a strike that stopped productions cold, it bled cash. If someone could promise labor peace, executives listened. Those talks ran through union leaders and middlemen who served as bridges between Hollywood and Chicago. He didn't star in those meetings. He didn't fly to the coast with a spotlight on him, but people who reported back to him did. Contracts were signed. Payments were arranged. For a while, it looked like a durable arrangement. He had come a very long way from that barbershop broom. He was a man both known and unknown, famous by name, anonymous by nature. He preferred it that way. He also knew the risks of any scheme that touched so many public figures. particularly when it crossed state lines and involved industries that attracted press attention by default. The ground under his feet, steady for years, felt a little less firm each time a grand jury sat, each time a rival talked too freely, each time a federal letter arrived, stamped with an eagle and a formal salutation. He was not a romantic figure. He was a manager of pressure, a broker of protection, a participant in unlawful enterprises that thrived in the gaps between enforcement and demand. The crimes were clear: illegal liquor trafficking in the Prohibition era, later, bribery, extortion through union influence, tax fraud in earlier years, the persistent coercion required to maintain the outfit's grip on corners of the city's economy. He didn't behave like the dramatized movie villain who loves spectacle. He treated wrongdoing like a business plan, with lines for cost and risk. That practicality made him formidable, but it never made him invincible. When you look back at those years, the story sits on a hinge. On one side is the era that made him prohibition and the industrialization of illegal liquor. On the other is the new landscape unions, studios, and federal investigations with sharper teeth. He stood in the doorway between the two, trying to carry his neat ledgers and careful manner into a different, brighter arena. For a time, it worked, but it also brought attention from agents who had learned to follow money to offices and homes that looked respectable from the sidewalk. This is where his life turns toward the coast, toward boardrooms in Los Angeles, toward middlemen who preferred tailored suits and lunch at studio commissaries instead of backroom tables. He was still the same man, quiet, formal, orderly. But the stage grew bigger, as did the consequences of any misstep. And somewhere inside him, the memory of locked doors and iron bars kept breathing. A faint drumbeat that would matter more with each new subpoena, with each new betrayal, with every whisper that someone under pressure might talk. Hollywood looked bright from far away, a clean ribbon of light along the coast. Up close, it was a machine that ran on schedules, unions, and deadlines, the kind of thing he understood. A city like that didn't need street corner swagger. It needed somebody who could talk to the person who held the clipboard and the person who signed the checks, someone who knew how to make a calendar move. He had built that skill in Chicago through years of showing up on time, choosing his words, and keeping his temper. When people say he took over, they miss the quiet part. He didn't stand on a table and announce it. He slid into a seat, listened, asked for a report, and made a change if the numbers didn't add up. That calm, the way he spoke like a foreman instead of a monarch, helped him steer the outfit through the years when the country shook with bank failures and breadlines. He wasn't the only architect of that pivot. Around him were men who specialized in different levers. One was a natural negotiator who could sit with labor officers at noon and with producers by dinner, always promising results without details. Another tracked gambling profits, handled the racing wire, and smoothed out disputes in neighborhoods that never ran out of bets. Another kept legal counsel nearby and made sure court dates didn't sneak up on anyone. He served as the hub of that wheel, not a warlord but a coordinator. In the middle 30s, as liquor money dried up, he relied on something he had learned back in the barber's chair. Many problems can be solved with the right cut at the right time. The outfit's strength was never just in muscle. It was in finding the places where legal business met practical obstacles and inserting itself there. In Chicago, that meant distributing coin machines, setting terms for card rooms, and influencing which haulers reached which docks. It also meant building ties inside unions that covered laundries, trucking, and entertainment. The practice went back before his tenure, but the system matured under his watch. The language stayed bland: committees, contracts, fees, yet the meaning stayed clear. If a firm wanted predictable weeks and avoided stoppages, agreements could be arranged. If a union wanted a smooth election and steady dues, favors were available. Those arrangements were illegal when they involved kickbacks, threats, and coercion. But they were dressed in suits and handled in conference rooms, not alleyways. He liked meeting in daylight. It made everything feel like business, which is what it was to him. In those rooms he was courteous, steady-eyed, not fond of small talk. He asked, "What's the schedule?" and "What's the number?" more than "How are the children?" He left warmth for private spaces. Associates appreciated the predictability. He didn't invite improvisation from the people who reported to him. He told them what the goal was and left them to choose the exact path, then reviewed the outcome with an even voice. People who craved drama had a hard time around him. People who liked order thrived. Hollywood became a test of that order. The movie industry had grown into a chain stretching from writers' rooms to backlots to projection booths. If a single link jammed, money stopped flowing. Unions represented the workers who turned scripts into scenes and soundtracks, and those unions had leaders who could declare a halt. In that world, leverage sat inside meeting halls and behind desks marked with titles no one on the street would recognize. The outfit reached those desks through intermediaries who spoke both dialects, the language of labor politics and the language of underworld promises. Two names rose fast in that role. A Chicago projectionist's figure who climbed into national office and his quick-talking deputy who seemed born to carry envelopes and deliver rapid assurances. Through them, a line was laid from Chicago to the studios. The pitch was simple. Keep the cameras rolling, keep premieres on schedule, keep headlines free of strike news. In exchange, certain payments would be made, layered to look like consulting fees or union funds, then sent back through trusted couriers. The exact sums changed with the season. What didn't change was the rhythm money went west to pay for extras, sets, and stars. Money came back east as the price of quiet. He didn't need to be on the lot to manage that rhythm. He expected reports as exact as finance sheets and gave direction when numbers slipped. This was extortion, packaged as industrial peace. He knew that. He didn't gild it to himself. He saw it as the shape of the market in a country where federal law had clipped one revenue stream and opened another in its place. Where liquor once demanded hidden warehouses and a fleet of trucks, Hollywood demanded proxies in unions and meetings in restaurants, far from the tabloids. It wasn't just about squeezing a person in a suit. It was about controlling the tap that refilled his organization's reserve. The care he put into that control showed in small habits, unannounced audits of couriers, rotating the men who flew to the coast, rarely using the same hotel twice in a row. He never bragged about that sort of thing. He simply expected it to be done. At the same time, Chicago businesses kept the outfit's home accounts healthy. There were routes for slot machines in bars that didn't have licenses yet welcomed the steady clink of nickels. There were agreements with gambling rooms that wanted the betting line from out of state. There were deals with building crews whose work could be delayed a day or sped up a week if someone made a call. He kept a particular eye on the race wire, the service that told bookmakers the results from distant tracks. The man who controlled that timing could ruin or rescue a room in minutes. Bringing that pipeline under the outfit's umbrella took patience and pressure, and it paid off. Those dollars didn't make front-page scandal. They made payroll. He did not deny or savor the word corruption. He treated it like weather. It existed, and a prudent person dressed accordingly. That didn't mean he allowed chaos. On the contrary, he disliked wildcat threats, freelance shakedowns, and men who tried to build their own fiefdoms. He cut those off, not with explosions, but with demotions, transfers, and quiet exile. If he had a code, it was built on efficiency and consistency. He also understood, as few did, how vulnerable public faces were. He carried the title that reporters liked, but he spread real authority among partners who gladly avoided headlines. It felt safer to him that way. He was proud of that structure, though he would never use a grand word like proud. He might have called it sensible. The police station shooting in late 1932 had sharpened his nerves. After recovering, he resumed control. But the sense of a trap never left him. He adjusted his habits, walking out of rooms early, sitting with his back to walls only when the exit was in sight, preferring cars with drivers he'd known for years. After repeal, raids were fewer. But federal attention had not burned out, it had shifted. He watched how agents spoke to accountants more than patrolmen, how a ledger could become a pair of handcuffs. He kept his returns cleaner, tried to hide income in layers of businesses, and still worried at night that someone would find a path through the paper. The Hollywood plan delivered for a while. Production stayed on schedule, enough payments moved to keep peace, and the bosses on both coasts learned how to shake hands without getting photographed together. The trouble, as always, arrived with a change in the air. In 1941, federal investigators took a hard look at the Union pipeline. They didn't encounter alley talkers. They found bank slips, postponed conferences, and luxury purchases that didn't match salaries. The two intermediaries who had strutted through backlots were arrested. The charges used plain words: extortion, conspiracy, and the indictments laid out a map from studio checks to union accounts to envelopes that flew east. Trials followed, and the juries didn't buy charm. Convictions landed heavy. For the outfit, that felt like a barometer dropping before a storm. He studied the documents and thought about the people who might talk. Fear didn't announce itself on his face, but he felt it. Not the fear of a fight. He had walked into enough risky rooms to know how that tasted. This was a different fear: the memory of walls, the sound of keys, the way air in a cell thickened with heat. Years earlier, he had told a friend he would rather face any danger than another long stretch behind bars. Now he had to consider whether the government might reach for him. He kept his distance from the coast, but distance didn't always protect a man when paper trails shortened. Inside the outfit, meetings multiplied. They were short, tense, and filled with sentences that died halfway across the table. The leaders agreed on one point: a response had to be organized. The question was, who would absorb the blow if indictments widened? Accounts of those meetings differ, because men remembered them differently, and the people who reported on them had their own angles. Some say partners pushed him to accept responsibility, arguing that his public status made him the logical target, and that a plea might reduce the damage for everybody else. Others claim he insisted he could still manage the fallout without taking a fall, that careful lawyering and distance from day-to-day threats would hold. The truth likely sat somewhere between those versions, as it often does. He tried to buy time. He sent messages through counsel, arranged for statements that depicted him as a businessman rather than a director of coercion, and reminded allies in city offices that the outfit still fulfilled promises that mattered to them. But the federal machine no longer moved in little circles. It had learned to carry cases across state lines, to connect acts in Los Angeles to meetings in Chicago, to argue that a conspiracy did not require a man to be on the scene if he guided it from afar. When the country entered war that winter, some thought the heat would die down. It didn't. The war gave prosecutors more reason to demand order in critical industries, and film was one of them. Public life for him shrank to a very small map home, a short list of restaurants, a narrow circuit of offices. He kept evenings quiet, reading papers with the lamp low. He told a relative that the only way to win was to stay calm. Calm for him was a set of habits. Wake, dress carefully, review numbers, decide which appointments could be canceled without signaling worry. Keep a lid on conversations that drifted toward rumor. He ate simply and didn't drink much. He had never been a showman, and he looked even less like one now. There is a version of this period that paints him as already finished. A man waiting for a knock on the door. That's too tidy. He was still making choices. Some sound. Some desperate. He authorized a legal defense fund for the men already in custody. He tried to firewall Chicago finances from coasts, shifting the way money moved so that indictments couldn't grab everything at once. He cut ties to a few go-betweens who had become liabilities. Each move had a cost, not just in cash, but in loyalty. People who felt abandoned sometimes found themselves in grand jury rooms, talking to prosecutors with notebooks open. The news from New York and Los Angeles got worse in 1,942. Appeals failed. Sentences stood. One of the convicted men, the fast-talking courier who had once enjoyed the flash of coastal life, began to consider a bargain. He had not grown up in the outfit's inner circles, and when prosecutors laid out a way to reduce his time, he listened. Word of that turn drifted back to Chicago like a draft under a door. He heard it, and knew what it meant. If that man talked, then senior leaders, he among them, would be named under oath. Paper trails are one thing. A live witness with details is another entirely. He didn't rage. It wasn't his style. He grew more careful, more contained. He trimmed his calendar to almost nothing, preferring conversations on porches and in parked cars with engines running. He asked for updates on the movements of federal agents and wanted to know when letters were delivered to other men in his circle. He doubted even familiar rooms. After years of keeping his voice low, he spoke even softer now, as if he could make himself smaller by will. The fact that he worried did not mean he had no options. He could have tried to flee. He had routes and means, but running sat poorly with everything he believed about control. He had built his power on steadiness. Leaving would be a public admission that the center had failed. He considered a voluntary surrender if it came to that, thinking a negotiated plea might spare him the worst. That was the rational part of his mind. The other part, the part that still heard the clank of cell doors and smelled the dust of prison corridors, could not see past the thought of confinement. People who knew him well said his fear of being locked away was the only thing that ever made him truly lose sleep. He also weighed the balance inside the outfit. If he absorbed the case, partners who were better at long-range planning might remain free to manage the home front. If he fought and lost, the damage could spread. Those were grim calculations, not the kind he had wanted to make when he first learned the rhythms of the business years earlier. But this was where the line of choices had led through barbers' chairs, across alleys, into boardrooms, and finally into a corner, with no good exits. He had never liked corners. By early 1943, the picture was stark. The Courier on the coast had cut a deal. Federal lawyers prepared new papers with a list of names that tied union titles to Chicago leaders, and described how envelopes moved, who set percentages, and how silence was bought. The exact day of the next move remained secret, but not the direction. He woke before dawn more often, stared at winter skies, and traced a plan that changed each time he ran it. Friends who visited said he looked composed and sounded even. A good suit can cover a lot. It can't quiet a mind that has run out of roots. He took more short drives then. Out past the center, out to streets where houses sat farther apart, and railroad lines cut flat across the land. He had always liked trains. The sound of them matched his old belief in timetables and reliable returns. Now, even that steady rhythm felt like a reminder that schedules can be made by other men, stamped and served whether you are ready or not. He held onto small routines where he could polish shoes, a careful shave, a nod to a neighbor who didn't read crime columns. The world still had ordinary things in it. He wasn't built to ignore them. The day was coming when envelopes would be opened and orders read aloud. He would have to decide, finally, whether to face another, sell, or cut his losses in a way that no one could reverse. He hadn't told anyone which choice he would make. Maybe he hadn't told himself. He simply kept moving through hours, precise as ever, while a file with his name on it moved toward him from a room with flags and seals on the wall. Dawn came cold and pale. He read the morning papers, learned which names were printed on the new documents, and folded the page with steady hands. A federal case tied to the film unions had moved from rumor to reality. Friends would later say he looked composed, that he tied his tie with the same slow care, that he kept his voice level. Inside, the walls were closer than ever. Prison had left a mark that no coat could cover. The idea of a cell had become more than a fear. It was a memory that never loosened. By noon, after a short walk away from home, Frank Nitti ended his life. There were no crowds, no speeches. A few brief notes remained, a last effort to keep blame from spreading and to put order where order had fallen apart. The shock rippled through Chicago without fanfare. The outfit's leaders stayed quiet, met behind thicker doors, and redrew lines in a hurry. Newspapers wrote sober pieces that mixed fact and caution, mindful that libel lawyers were part of this world too. At the funeral, the circle closed ranks. Relatives stood with faces set. Associates kept their eyes on the floor. No one wanted to invite more attention than the moment already demanded. The city itself carried on as cities do, streetcars running, shops opening, the routine life that seems to continue no matter which headline shakes the morning. His death didn't erase what had come before. It forced a reckoning. To understand why his world had narrowed to that last choice, you have to trace the shape of his authority and the list of wrongs that built it. He had been the face the public recognized after the famous boss went away to federal prison. That didn't make him the supreme commander. Chicago's underworld had learned, through bitter experience, to spread decisions among a few steady men. Paul Ricca was the strategist, deliberate and cool. Tony Accardo excelled at long-term planning and risk control. Jake Guzik kept the books and the channels that greased gears in city offices. Murray Humphreys dealt with union deals in a way that blended persuasion with pressure. Nitti's lane was coordination, making sure that arrangements were kept, schedules held, and money moved without drama. He also became the name reporters wrote when they needed a single person to stand for a group that preferred the shadows. His record showed the arc of a man who had started small and climbed in a world where the law and the market pulled in opposite directions. Early arrests had been for petty theft and related offenses. Small jobs, quick money, sometimes charges dropped, sometimes a night in a cell. Prohibition expanded the stage. He helped organize bootlegging routes, buying or producing liquor outside the legal market, storing it, transporting it, and supplying speakeasies that wanted steady deliveries. That business, unlawful from top to bottom, demanded a system. He built systems. Drivers followed changing paths. Safe houses and warehouses rotated. The outfit cut deals with friendly cops and ward bosses. When payments didn't secure calm, threats replaced negotiation. Violence was part of that era, though he preferred not to be present when tempers flared. He oversaw revenue. Others handled the loud end. Bribery became both shield and lever. Cash went to lawmen who looked the other way, to clerks who lost forms, to politicians who remembered to forget. Those acts, routine in his circle, were crimes all the same corruption that bent public duty toward private profit. He treated them like paperwork because that was what made them effective. A quiet envelope kept a truck moving and a ledger clean. He liked ledgers clean. The government adapted. After years of chasing rum runners and raiding warehouses, agents learned to follow money. Tax cases became the tool that broke backs no bullet could touch. In 1931, he pleaded guilty to federal tax charges tied to unreported income from the prior decade. The sentence that followed changed him. Even a relatively short term in a federal penitentiary made something in him refuse the thought of ever going back. Friends described a calm man who suddenly hated confined spaces. That fear was not a myth created after the fact. It shaped every decision he made later. Then came the police station shooting in December 1932. Summoned for questioning, he was shot at close range inside the detective bureau. The first claims said he had drawn on officers. Evidence later cast doubt. Powder burns on his clothes that suggested he was fired upon at near contact. A wound on an officer's hand that looked self-inflicted. The most serious charges against him were eventually dropped, and the incident cast a long shadow on the department. For him, the lesson was simple and terrifying. Danger came not just from rivals, but from rooms that were supposed to be safe. He recovered, reassumed his seat, and cut his daily life down to routes and rooms he trusted. Repeal arrived in 1933 and removed the liquor river that had fed the outfit. Nitti's strength was exactly what the group needed, the ability to pivot without panic. He helped redirect energy into gambling, coin-operated machines in bars, and above all, labor racketeering. That last one required brains more than brawn. The outfit inserted itself into unions across industries, cleaners and dyers, trucking, building trades, service workers. The technique followed a pattern. Back friendly candidates for office inside a union. Cultivate influence with business agents who controlled job lists and grievances. Pressure employers to pay for peace instead of facing strikes or delays. Call it extortion or labor relations. The outcome was the same. Businesses paid to keep work moving, and the outfit took a cut through fronts and shells. He wasn't the architect of every move in that line. Humphreys had deep knowledge of union law and custom, and Ricca drew the larger map. But Nitti made sure pipelines did not leak. He insisted on reliable couriers, staggered deliveries, and clean books for fronts laundries, a few small firms, a string of vending and service companies that looked ordinary from the sidewalk. Tax avoidance continued too. He kept personal returns conservative, but could never fully align income on paper with the life of a man who sat at the top of a large illegal enterprise. That problem would have returned even without the Hollywood scheme. With it, the problem turned into a crisis. Hollywood was simple in concept, complicated in execution. The outfit used its influence through IATSE, the stagehands and projectionists, to make or break film production schedules. Willie Beoff, a man from Nitti's orbit in Chicago, and George Brown, a union officer who climbed to national leadership, carried the plan west. Studios paid to avoid walkouts. The cash route changed over time, but usually moved from studio accounts to union-controlled funds or friendly consultants, then into envelopes that made the trip back east. The crime label was plain: extortion and conspiracy. with the interstate part giving federal prosecutors jurisdiction. For years, the arrangement survived because the industry did not want scandal, and the participants enjoyed their roles too much to talk. By 1941, the dam cracked. Investigations gathered testimony and bank records. Brown and Byoff were arrested. Trials brought convictions. Appeals failed. Those men faced real time and saw leniency only in exchange for cooperation. When word reached Chicago that Byoff had chosen to talk, panic would be too strong a word for Nitti's mood. Yet the effect was similar. He knew what a witness could do that a ledger could not. Fill in the blanks between meetings. Give juries a story. Put senior figures in the room even if they had never left Chicago. The law did not require him to be on a studio lot to be guilty if he had guided the plan. Inside meetings got tense. He met with Ricca and others to discuss what to do if papers named them. Accounts of those talks vary. Some say partners pushed him to take responsibility, arguing that his name was already public and that one man absorbing blame might insulate the rest. Others say he volunteered, not out of nobility but because the alternative, risking more years in a cell, was unthinkable. He weighed options, negotiated plea, trial strategy, even flight, but every path bent back toward the thing he dreaded. That dread explains the last day more than any single order or argument in a back room. The indictment that included his name left little room to move. He put on a suit, stepped outside, and chose a final exit rather than return to confinement. The notes tried to hold some pieces of his life together: respect for family, concern for those who might be drawn into the case, a wish to keep peace among partners who were still standing. They did not change facts, but they reflected the way he had always managed problems, with paperwork and an attempt at control. After his death, the Hollywood case pressed on. Other leaders were tried that autumn and sentenced to federal terms. The outfit survived by reshuffling authority. Ricca and Accardo kept the long view. Humphreys guided labor deals, and the network absorbed the blow by widening its circle of middle managers. That was the design. No single name could collapse the structure. Chicago's underworld had learned, too often, what happened when one man at the top tried to carry everything. Nitti's fate became a lesson in both the limits of control and the cost of being the public face. He had not been a visionary. He had been a working executive of illicit enterprise, a manager of force contained by calculation. His crimes stretched across decades: theft in lean years, bootlegging during Prohibition, bribery as a tool for survival, tax evasion when the math didn't square, the systematic pressure of labor racketeering, participation, by design and oversight, in the film industry extortion. He ordered meetings, not massacres. He moved money, not headlines. Others handled violence when it erupted. That does not lessen his responsibility, only clarifies its nature. He knew exactly what he was part of, and kept doing it, because it paid and because the system he helped build rewarded discipline more than daring. Away from work, he tried to keep a home that looked normal. He married, hosted family, adopted the quiet pleasures of a man who liked a good meal in a clean yard. Riverside offered a buffer from downtown noise. Neighbors recalled a polite homeowner who nodded hello, tipped well at shops, and did not bring business to the block. He enjoyed a neat wardrobe and left generous gratuities, habits that came from a desire to be remembered for his manners rather than his occupation. Those who loved him saw warmth. Those who worked with him saw order. Those who hunted him saw a target that moved carefully and rarely at night. The city around him shifted as he aged. Chicago politicians changed. Old alliances frayed and reformed. Reformers gained seats, then lost them. Police commissioners came and went. The outfit survived those swings by keeping its base in gambling, services, and unions, rather than in showy front businesses that drew attention. He supported that strategy instinctively. He did not expand into areas he did not understand. He let others chase new ideas while he made sure cash arrived the same way it had the week before. There were myths he did nothing to promote or debunk. Stories linked the outfit to every big event, including national tragedies. After Chicago's mayor was shot in Miami in 1933, some people whispered that gangsters had been the real target. Historians remain unconvinced. Evidence points to a lone attacker with a grievance against power in general. Nitti never fed those rumors. He understood that famous lies draw fire. He preferred the dull truth of his method: Collect, count, pay, repeat. His temper stayed even when others flared. He didn't slam doors, didn't give speeches. Associates learned to read the smallest signals. A pause meant a person had over-explained. A question about numbers meant a promise would be measured. A reminder about routes and schedules meant someone had cut a corner and would soon find himself moved to a quiet job or no job at all. Enforcement, when required, rarely came from him directly. He sent men whose presence answered the question before it was asked. If someone had to be pushed harder, he made it clear that he did not want to hear details. That distance was deliberate, a legal shield, and a personal preference. Looking back, the paradox is sharp. The same habits that built his career restraint, order, faith in paperwork, left him exposed once documents became weapons in court, and witnesses tied those documents to his office. The same caution that kept him out of alleys gave him the public profile that prosecutors needed. The same memory of prison that made him vigilant made him unable to imagine living through another term. The story is not a rise and fall epic filled with melodrama. It is the story of a man who operated like a clerk in a world of crime until the clerks came with warrants. What stays when the noise dies is a simple ledger. On one side, an immigrant who worked, learned English, built connections, rose from a barber's chair to a penthouse table, married, tried to maintain dignity, and kept promises to his circle. On the other, crimes that bent and broke the law for profit, schemes that used pressure against workers and owners alike, payments that corroded public trust, and a final act that left grief in a small house and problems for everyone who shared his ledger. Chicago moved on, as Chicago always does. The outfit adjusted, as it had been designed to do. His name slipped from the headlines and settled into footnotes, then into the books and films that prefer clean arcs to messy facts. Frank Nitti was not the loudest figure in his era. He was a necessary one for the system he served. When prohibition filled basements with barrels, he made schedules. When unions offered leverage, he made lists. When the coast shimmered with studio lots, he moved money with men whose hands looked clean until the papers printed their names. He lived by routine, and ended when routine could no longer shield him from the one outcome he had feared since the day he first walked out of a federal gate. The life was real, not a legend, and the record is there in court files, police reports, and the memories of a city that learned to recognize power dressed like a quiet neighbor. In the end, what he left behind was a template and a warning. Spread leadership, so pressure does not break the structure. Keep the cash simple. Avoid spectacle. Understand that the calmest face in a photograph might carry the heaviest dread. People who knew him well remembered the careful man who hated tardiness, the neighbor who waved from a porch, the executive who never forgot a figure. The rest of us inherit a name that marks an age when law and commerce collided in back rooms and on bright lots, and when a man who trusted timetables learned at last that someone else's clock can still run your life. He left behind a city that preferred routines to ruptures. The outfit's calendar barely paused. Men who had met him in quiet rooms now met without him, and the machine kept turning because that was how it had been built. No single gear could bring it to a stop. The papers ran a few sober columns, then moved on to war headlines and rationing news. In Riverside, neighbors remembered a courteous man who had tipped well and kept his yard neat. At Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, he joined other names from an era Chicago would argue about for generations. Inside the circle, authority shifted to the men who had long guided strategy. Paul Ricca, careful and cool, continued to steer policy even as lawmen drew closer. Tony Accardo, methodical and watchful, absorbed more responsibility and insisted on lower profiles all around. Jake Guzik kept the financial veins open, the sensitive lines to city offices intact. Murray Humphreys focused on labor, a translator between legal language and street logic. That spread of roles had existed for years. Nitti had been the coordinator at the edge of the stage, the figure reporters could point to while deeper planners stayed in the wings. With him gone, the balance became even more deliberate. Everyone understood the lesson his career had taught. The front of the house attracts attention. The real work happens in the back. The case on the coast did not disappear with his passing. Federal lawyers pressed forward. The film union scheme had been mapped with testimony and bank records. Willie Bioff and George Brown, the pair who had carried the outfit's leverage into Hollywood's labor halls, were already convicted. Appeals failed. Cooperation followed. Their accounts connected studio checks to union officials and then to couriers who brought envelopes back east. In late 1943, several senior Chicago figures, Ricca among them, along with other high-ranking aides, admitted guilt in court rather than risk a trial built on those witnesses and documents. Sentences were stiff by the standards of the day, and the government congratulated itself on breaking a pipeline that had drained an entire industry under the table. Accardo kept the foundation steady while that storm moved through. He did what Nitti had always valued: cut down spectacle, limit unnecessary talk, and rely on steady earners. Bookmaking expanded quietly, through rooms that kept no neon and paid rent on time. The race wire, the service that told bookmakers the results from distant tracks, remained a prized asset. Control of information was still power. Coin-operated machines stayed on their routes, nickels turning into payroll. Labor influence continued, but with greater caution. Words like consultant and advisor still appeared on paperwork, but the lines leading back to outfit desks were redrawn with thicker insulation. The federal model, follow the paper, flip the courier, had proven effective. The response was to make those papers duller and those couriers fewer. Looking back at what Nitti had actually done, you can sort his life into distinct chapters of wrongdoing without drifting into sensationalism. In the 1910s, as a young man learning the city, he was caught up in small thefts, suspected of handling stolen goods, and arrested for carrying a weapon. Those were street-level offenses, the kind that fill the blotter in a big city and then fade. Prohibition turned the dial. He helped organize illegal distribution of liquor contracts with suppliers, storage and delivery, payment routes, and the bribery necessary to keep authorities at a distance. The cash that flowed through that period, large, steady, often in small bills, funded the outfit's transformation from a gang into an enterprise. Bribes, by then a routine cost of doing business, were crimes in themselves, corruption that bent courtroom schedules and patrol routes to private ends. The tax case that followed was a direct product of that period. After federal agents failed to pin specific shipments on senior men, they followed income numbers instead. In 1931, Nitti pleaded guilty to tax charges tied to unreported earnings from the bootlegging years. He served time, and the time changed him. He emerged with a fixed dread of confinement that shaped every later calculation. That inner weight, not a sudden rush of fate, explains the calm face he wore through the rest of his career and the short list of options he could accept when cornered. With repeal, the outfit's crime portfolio shifted. Nitti's role became most visible in labor racketeering. The methods were simple in outline and complex in execution. Back candidates for union office, cultivate stewards who controlled work lists and grievances, and then sell peace to employers who could not afford delays. Payments were framed as benefits or consulting fees, then diverted. When persuasion failed, pressure replaced it threats of stoppage, pickets at key sites, inspectors who suddenly found reasons to recheck permits. The crimes in that line were extortion, conspiracy, and often fresh layers of tax evasion when the flows were disguised. He did not handle every step himself. He set the schedule, reviewed the numbers, and held people to results. That managerial approach gave the outfit resilience. It also made him seem to outsiders like the boss of all bosses when he was, in truth, the most visible executive of a board. Hollywood fit that pattern. Through allies inside IATSE, the outfit leveraged the power to halt or smooth productions. The studios paid for predictability. Money moved through fronts and union accounts, and then went back to Chicago. For years, the arrangement worked because each participant told himself a comforting story. The union was getting resources. The studio was buying stability. The men in Chicago were providing a service. That story collapsed in court. The juries saw what the law calls it. The outcome stood. The scheme's lifespan tells you as much about American industry in the 1930s as it does about the outfit. A web of deadlines and budgets so tight that even illegal guardians of peace could carve out a large, hidden toll. Nitti's portion of responsibility was clear. He had been part of the team that authorized and benefited from that pressure. He oversaw the people who counted and carried the money. He owned the risks he accepted. At the same time, there are lines the record does not support crossing. Some have tried to glue his name to every violent episode of the era, including the worst of the bootlegging wars. Contemporary evidence does not show him as the architect of those spectacles. He preferred balance sheets to explosions, and when violence occurred, it was typically at a remove from his desk. He was not a folk hero, not a dark knight, and not the caricature that later television would draw. He was a disciplined manager of an illegal enterprise who chose quiet efficiency over theater. The 1932 shooting inside police headquarters sits in its own strange corner of his story. He was summoned for questioning during a political moment when the city wanted big arrests. Shots were fired. He was wounded at close range. An officer had a hand wound later judged likely self-inflicted, and the attempted murder case against Nitti fell apart. Years later, people still argued about motives and orders, about whether someone in authority had wanted him silenced. What the incident changed undeniably was his sense of safety. If a man could be attacked inside a government building, then caution had to become more than habit. It had to become a rule. After his death, the outfit hardened that rule into doctrine. Public faces were a liability. Meetings were shorter. Lawyers sat closer. Front businesses multiplied. Laundries, distribution companies, cleaning services, vending routes, the kinds of firms that live in ordinary neighborhoods and draw no camera flashes. If the aim during Prohibition had been to move crates without being seen, the aim now was to move invoices without being understood. That was Nitti's legacy within the circle. Normalize control, routinize pressure, retreat from spectacle, and expect every ledger to be read someday by someone with a badge. Outside the circle, his legacy became something else, a figure used by storytellers to stand for an era. Later, films and television shows reshaped him to fit dramatic needs. On-screen versions turned him into a swaggering antagonist or a rooftop brawler. In real life, he avoided public scenes, disliked improvisation, and spent most of his hours in offices and restaurants where the loudest sound was the scrape of a chair. The difference matters because it sketches a truer outline of the world he inhabited. Less fireworks, more paperwork, less myth, more method. The question that lingers is what his story says about the city that made him. Chicago of his time was a place where formal institutions and informal networks met at the edge of every contract. Voters wanted services. Politicians wanted votes. Businesses wanted predictability. Unions wanted power to defend members' interests. In those gaps, people like Nitti built profitable bridges and charged tolls. He did not invent the demand. He exploited it. His crimes, bootlegging, bribery, extortion, conspiracy, tax evasion, were not the wild gestures of a lone outlaw, but the steady output of a system that tolerated shortcuts as long as things worked most days. That doesn't excuse them. It sets them in the light where they belong. There were tender parts of his life the file boxes can't capture. Family dinners where he tried to cordon off work from home. Holidays spent without the loud talk he heard elsewhere. A preference for neat clothes that made him blend into downtown crowds. Politeness to neighbors who never read his name beyond a headline and saw only a man who said hello. Those details don't change the ledger. They do remind you that people who run harmful systems often look like the middle of the crowd. As for the rumors that circled in his day and after, like the claim that the outfit had been involved in the Miami shooting that killed Chicago's mayor in 1933, historians have not found solid proof linking Nitti or his circle to that event. The attacker was an angry loner whose shots went wild in a crowd gathered to see a president-elect. The rumor persisted because it fit an appetite for tidy plots. Facts are rarely that neat, and he, who distrusted spectacle, would have understood why it was better to leave myths alone. Time moved on. The men he had worked beside faced trials, served sentences, and in some cases came home on parole a few years later. The outfit adjusted again, as it had after every pressure wave, Ricca advising from the background, Accardo setting tone from the front office, new lieutenants stepping into roles that had been empty only briefly. Chicago's economy grew in other directions. After the war, suburbs spread, factories switched from bombs to appliances, and the city's politics changed hands. The machine Nitti had helped refine did not vanish. It blended into a new landscape, where phones replaced couriers and white-collar fronts replaced backroom ledgers. If he had lived to see it, he would have recognized the logic immediately. His story endures because it resembles a quiet engine. There are no shouting speeches, no last-minute turns. There is work, of a kind the law condemns, done with a clerk's patience and an executive's calm. There is a rise that looks, from the outside, like a man who simply kept showing up, and a fall that was not a spectacle but a private decision shaped by years of dread. Most of all, there is a template for power that others imitated. Keep it close, keep it divided, and keep it dull to the eye. That was his craft. That was his crime. And if you walk past the old addresses Taylor Street, the near West Side, the river bridges, you won't find plaques with his name. You'll find storefronts and traffic and the ordinary rhythm of a city that never stops for long. His traces are in the habits he left behind in an organization that learned to stay off the front page. His name, once stamped in big type, now lives in footnotes and files, in court transcripts and memoirs, in stories told by families over Sunday meals about a neighbor who always wore a hat and never stayed long on the sidewalk. He had always moved like a man who understood clocks. That talent didn't come from school. It came from years of watching rooms, keeping promises, and learning which paths stayed open. If you track his life backward from the headlines, you find a boy in Angry, a family that crossed an ocean in the 1890s, and a teenager who took any job that paid. In Brooklyn, he swept, carried bundles, and learned the barber's trade. A barbershop chair taught him rhythm. Customers sat, talked, and left lighter. He listened and memorized. Names, debts, habits, small facts that, together, described how a neighborhood worked. He kept that habit when he moved west. Chicago in the 1910s felt fast and crowded, a place where every block had its own rules. He rented a chair in a shop, cut hair, and kept his voice even. He was neat. People trusted neat. He built a side income repairing watches and trading small pieces of jewelry. Police files from those years show a pattern familiar in immigrant districts. Arrests for petty theft. Suspicions about fenced goods. A night or two in a cell. Cases dropped or forgotten. Nothing in those early lines suggests a kingpin. Everything in those lines hints at a man who held a map in his head. Who owed who? Which sergeant liked favors? Which ward boss controlled permits? The city already had a shadow economy long before the first keg moved in a false-bottom truck. There were gambling rooms, houses of paid company, and quiet clubs where the envelope on the counter had more power than the badge by the door. He drifted toward that underworld because it paid and because his skills fit. He could be patient. He could be steady. He could keep his temper when others burned hot. Those were rare qualities in a business that often prized noise. Senior men noticed. Names like Johnny Torrio and Al Capone were learning how to turn vice into a system. They needed men who could run pieces of that system without breaking it. When Prohibition arrived in 1920, the city did not sober up, it reorganized. Liquor became a logistics problem. A man who could design a route, negotiate with suppliers, decide which driver took which night, and keep the sums straight became invaluable. That was the job he took and perfected. He made a chain from lakefront to neighborhood. Boats brought crates from Canada or from points along the coast. Warehouses held them. Couriers checked seals and passed receipts. Trucks rolled just before dawn or late at night, never at the same hour 2 days in a row. A handful of policemen preferred a sealed envelope to a pursuit, and precinct captains learned which doors to knock on if they wanted campaign help. He was not the face that barked orders in loud rooms. He was the one who asked quietly where tomorrow's shipment would be and whether the driver knew the detour if a bridge closed. He understood the political weather. Chicago's first ward had long brokered agreements that let vice live so long as votes were counted and trouble didn't spill onto the front steps of power. Aldermen cut ribbons at parades by day and shook hands in back rooms by night. He read that rhythm and stayed within it. Cash went out as a cost of doing business. Protection flowed back. This wasn't romance. It was a ledger in motion, and it made the outfit into an enterprise that could afford lawyers, payoffs, and a payroll that stretched from bagmen to attorneys. Capone drew cameras. Nitti kept balance. In Cicero, where the outfit shifted base when downtown heat rose, election days brought ugly scenes that made national papers. He was not the brawler on that stage. He was in rooms nearby, making calls, reminding people that deliveries could not stop just because the city was shouting. That was always his instinct. When others performed, he maintained. He wore good suits. He tipped without showing off. He didn't drink much. He preferred short meetings and longer lists. The 1920s taught him two lessons that would define the rest of his life. First, the city only bites hard when someone forces it to. Second, paper is safer than bragging. He put more distance between himself and risky acts each year. He had drivers he trusted, and drivers he did not. He didn't ride along if he could avoid it. He kept a lawyer's number on a small piece of paper in his wallet, and rarely raised his voice, even when money went missing, putting a hand on a man's shoulder and saying, "That will not happen again," in a flat tone did more, in his world, than a shout. Crimes piled up, of course. Bootlegging was a crime. Bribery was a crime. Violence supported both. Even when he wasn't in the room where it happened, he made the case to himself and to others that he ran a business that met demand. That's how many in that era explained away the harm. It's also why the harm lasted so long. Money from liquor built an organization that couldn't be taken apart in one raid. By the late 20s, the outfit had tentacles in coin machine routes, gambling halls, and a dozen union halls where stewards controlled which crew showed up on which block on which day. He was central to that growth because he understood how to line up people and tasks without calling attention to himself. The winter of 1929 froze a picture in the public mind that never thawed. 7 men in a garage and a city shocked into a new kind of outrage. He had not ordered that event, did not stand on that floor, and did not profit from the attention it brought. What it did to him, and to his circle, was simple: fewer public meetings, more attorneys, more cover. The outfit traded neon for frosted glass doors. He was built for that change. If you were looking for a warlord, you wouldn't have thought of him. If you wanted a scheduler, a fixer of bottlenecks, a man who could make money flow without spilling it, he was already in the chair. The federal shift to tax cases reached him soon after. Agents with thick files cared less about which barrel was where, and more about whether the sums on a return matched the life a man led. In 1931, he answered for unreported income. He pleaded guilty. He served a term in federal custody and paid a fine. Those are the bare facts. The deeper truth is that prison altered his inner balance. He came out with a rigid fear of confinement. Claustrophobia is too clinical a word for what friends described. He had nightmares. He kept windows open even in winter. He avoided elevators when he could. That fear might have been invisible to a casual acquaintance. To anyone close, it was part of his day. Late in 1932, city politics turned, and the police staged a show of force. He was called in, sat under bright lights, and by the end of the day, had bullets in him from very close range. Officers claimed he had drawn first. A wound on a detective's hand was held up as proof. Later tests and testimony raised sharp doubts. Powder burns suggested contact firing. The officer's wound looked self-inflicted to experts. The attempted murder case against him dissolved. The incident left a mark deeper than any scar. If an ambush could happen in the detective bureau, trust had to be rationed more carefully than ever. Repeal closed one chapter and opened another. Liquor went legal. Warehouses changed owners. Trucks went to other routes. The outfit did not vanish. It turned to the work it had already started. Gambling, services, and leverage over organized labor. He helped build the new map. The cleaners and dyers, the trucking firms, the building trades, the service unions, each offered points of entry where influence over schedules and job lists could be turned into cash. It wasn't only about threats. It was about steering elections inside locals, placing friendly business agents, and framing payments as advice. When persuasion didn't get a signature, picket lines and slowdowns did. He didn't stand at the curb. He set the timetable, reviewed returns, and made sure men didn't freelance their own shakedowns. Hollywood looked like a distant prize, but it was simply another industry with deadlines. Through allies and IATs, the outfit gained reach into studios that could not afford delays. George Brown rose within the union. Willie Beoff carried messages. Studios paid to avoid trouble that would cost more than any envelope. Money traveled through accounts that looked legitimate, and came back east in pieces. For years, that rhythm worked. He watched it from Chicago, expected punctual reports, and kept the risks spread across layers so no single arrest could expose the whole design. That plan held until federal investigators connected signatures to meetings and flipped the courier who knew the most. When that happened, the options left to him narrowed to one he could not accept. He ended his life in 1943. The people who loved him grieved. The organization he had helped design continued, guided by men who had long preferred the background. The case against his partners proceeded. Guilty pleas landed. Sentences followed. Chicago's underworld revised its rules again. Fewer faces in the paper, more walls between the money and the men. What does all this say about his daily method? He woke early. He dressed well. He picked familiar restaurants and kept meals short. He carried notes folded once, never twice. He never repeated orders if a man had already heard them. He trusted old drivers more than new ones. He never gambled in rooms he didn't control. He kept family life separate and preferred to be remembered by neighbors as the man who returned a wave rather than the name in a headline. He disliked shouting. He liked a clean account. He accepted that risk was part of the job. He tried to cancel the part of risk that involved chaos. He didn't invent corruption. He used it. Bribes to public servants were routine and wrong. They made a city work in a distorted way and made honest work harder. He knew that and did it anyway because it served his goals. Extortion through unions hurt both workers and owners by turning the noise of conflict into a toll road. He knew that too. The defensemen like him offered, "We keep the peace," was a story people buy when the alternative looks worse. The law did not buy it. The record shows why. There are details people still argue about. Was he truly in command after the famous boss went away? Or did Ricca and Accardo hold the main reins while he played public manager? Most researchers now say the second version is closer to the truth. Did he crave attention? No. Did he enjoy wealth? Within limits, yes. He liked comfort, not ostentation. He was careful with money that wasn't his, and generous to those who made his life smoother. Did he order violent acts? He oversaw an enterprise where force was part of the toolbox. He set pressures in motion that others pushed to the edge. When a problem required noise, he stepped away and expected a report later. That was deliberate, both as management style and as legal strategy. The city he navigated changed him and was changed by him. The political machine that traded favors for votes learned to speak a language that men like him could use. The police, some honest, some bought, learned to expect envelopes and to fear the wrong officer's ambition. Journalists learned to write around gaps, to print what they could prove and hint at the rest. Reformers kept files and waited for chances to push cases forward. He read all of that and adjusted. He remains, in the end, a study in quiet power. No grand speeches, no public crusade, no theater, beyond a neat fedora and a steady walk. A boy from Angry who became an American by work and then chose a path outside the law. A coordinator who turned crimes into routines. A man who feared walls so much that the thought of another term ended every other calculation. His story is not an excuse for the harms he helped cause. It is a record of how those harms were carried out so calmly that, for years, a great city treated them as normal. The aftermath speaks for itself. The informer who broke the Hollywood case later died far away from the coast he once enjoyed, a reminder that cooperation has its own cost in that world. The leaders who pleaded out came home years later and resumed advisory roles from deeper shadows. The outfit survived because it never depended on one person. That, more than any legend about guns and alleys, is what he helped build. A system that keeps moving after the name at the top of the newspaper is gone. Walk through the old neighborhoods and you won't see him. You'll see the ordinary life he used as cover shops, stoops, parish steps. A barber pole turning slowly in a window. Somewhere a clerk counts a till, a driver checks a route, a foreman studies a schedule. Those were his instruments. He mastered them in an era when law, business, and need crossed in messy ways, and he played them until the tune he relied on stopped. That's the real outline of Frank Nitti, a man who treated crime like a calendar, who knew the value of being on time, and who proved, by the way his story ends and echoes, that quiet can be as dangerous as noise when a city lets it run too long. In the files, his name shows up in different shapes. Some reports spell it Nitto, some Nitti. On immigration lists, he is a boy from Angry. On police cards, he is a barber, then a suspect, then a figure who must be watched. Newspapers preferred the crisper spelling and the nickname that stuck. Court documents used whichever name the clerk already knew. That muddle tells a small truth about him. He never bothered to fix the record. He didn't want to be famous. He wanted to get through the day without leaving fingerprints on the story. People later argued about titles. Was he the boss after the famous leader went away on a tax case? Inside the outfit, authority fanned out like spokes. Ricca shaped policy. Accardo guarded the future and cut down exposure. Guzik moved money and soothed trouble in municipal offices. Humphreys worked the union angle with patience and smooth talk. Nitti sat at the junction where all of that had to be turned into timetables and cash flow. Reporters wrote his name because it was easier to print one figure than a committee. He accepted that and tried to keep the rest of the board out of the frame. He had made his path by fitting himself to the moments that paid. As a young man, he learned the barber's craft, a service that brought stories to his chair and taught him to read faces while his hands stayed steady. He graduated from that quiet school into a city that ran on both law and arrangement. Early arrests for small thefts and suspicion of fencing showed a young worker testing the edge of the map. He spent nights in cells, walked out, and went back to jobs that either didn't ask questions or asked the right ones. When the new liquor laws arrived, he didn't reinvent himself. He scaled up what he already did well: organize people, guard schedules, and collect on promises. Bootlegging was the center of gravity for more than a decade. He helped set up routes, storage, drivers, and payments. That work crossed lines every hour, transporting forbidden stock, bribing officers to look away, using threats when a customer tried to skip. He wasn't the man who drew a crowd. He was the one who made a delivery system that could bear the weight of a fast-growing city's thirst. The cash from that trade turned loose gangs into a functioning enterprise with lawyers, couriers, bookkeepers, and a bench of middle managers who could swap places when needed. Violence existed in that world, but it was not his preferred tool. People called him the Enforcer, a headline nickname that overpromised. If force was required, others handled it. He chose rooms with doors that closed softly and minutes that were counted in quiet. He liked numbers, hated unpredictability, and adjusted routes, as if he were dispatching a fleet for a legal firm. The reputation that grew around him came from that discipline. He returned calls, he paid on time, he remembered what he had said, and expected the same of others. The government's pivot to paper hit him like a tide. When Treasury investigators focused on returns instead of car chases, the old system had few defenses. In 1931, he answered for unreported income from the years when barrels moved at night. He pleaded guilty. He served a federal term. The time behind walls left the mark people closest to him talked about most. It wasn't just dislike. It was a dread that changed how he lived. He kept windows cracked in winter, stayed away from packed elevators when he could, and checked exits in any unfamiliar room before he sat down. Friends learned not to joke about long trips to places with bars. The police station shooting at the end of 1932 hardened his caution further. He had been called in, and shots were fired at short range. Early explanations said he had tried to shoot an officer. Tests and testimony didn't match that claim. The case faded, but the lesson stayed. He now believed danger could arrive in places that were supposed to be safe. He recovered in body and returned to his desk in manner, but something in him kept listening for the sound of a door that wouldn't open. After repeal, the outfit laid a new grid across the city. Gambling kept cash steady. Coin machines multiplied in back corners of bars and lunchrooms. The race wire, those streams of results from tracks far away, came under tighter control, and unions offered the lever that made numbers jump. He helped plan the work that went into labor influence, identifying offices inside locals that controlled job lists and grievances, backing candidates who would listen, and turning negotiations into a path for regular payments labeled in polite language. The crimes there were clear in law: extortion and conspiracy, though the practice tried to look like ordinary business. He managed that machine without fanfare, keeping personalities from tearing it apart and modest front firms from drawing too much interest. The fight over the cleaners and dyers in the middle 30s showed the shape of this work. Customers wanted garments picked up and returned on time. Owners needed routing and basic protection. Unions wanted fair deals. In that mix, the outfit found space to charge a toll. The tools were small pressures, a threatened work stoppage here, a bottleneck at a depot there, a dispute that only ended if a certain call was returned. It was all unlawful, delivered in ways that looked banal. He preferred it that way. He believed danger grew with spectacle. The same pattern extended to building service workers, elevator operators, watchmen, janitors in office towers. Holding sway over that workforce meant a hand on the heartbeat of the loop. A union leader who owed his rise to outfit backing could nudge payroll talks one way or the other. The names on those cases, men charged with skimming and fraud, were not always his, but the style was familiar. Install influence, channel dues, keep talks moving until funds are gathered, and stay far enough from the surface to argue later that the wrongdoing was a surprise. He did not write such defenses. He relied on lawyers for that. He made the river that ran under the sidewalk and tried to keep it from rising. Hollywood fit the method. Through allies inside the stagehands and projectionists, the outfit extended its reach into studios that could not afford interruption. Payments, dressed up as contributions or fees, flowed. Couriers moved between coasts. Reports arrived with figures that either pleased him or triggered short, cold conversations. For a time, the arrangement worked because no one on the outside wanted a scandal, and no one on the inside wanted to lose their place. When it failed the way the government liked, with witnesses, bank slips, and a story a jury could follow. The collapse of that scheme trapped him between a public role and a private fear. He saw the papers. He knew the reach of federal charges that used the word conspiracy. He understood that a witness could draw a line from a union meeting in Los Angeles to a lunch table in Chicago without leaving his seat. He weighed what to do and found that every road bent toward a cell. He chose a final act rather than return to that. The coroner recorded the fact. The city turned the page. What remained was the infrastructure he had helped refine, and the example of how to keep it going without fireworks. Rica and Ricardo took counsel from deeper shadows. The outfit leaned harder into quiet earners and kept labor work cautious. The wire service fed bookmakers with less drama. The front companies became less interesting on paper. Meetings shrank. Lawyers multiplied. The lessons he had lived by no boasting: keep your distance from risky acts, break tasks into routines, plan the exit before the entrance became standing orders. His home life had always looked ordinary by design. A house in Riverside with tidy rooms and a small yard. A routine that set family apart from business. He favored neighborhood shops where he overpaid and undertalked. In the kitchen, conversation stayed away from work. On the sidewalk, greetings stayed brief. Family and close friends remembered warmth that rarely surfaced in public: a steady presence, a preference for small gatherings, a habit of sending a basket when someone fell ill. Those details sit next to the record of crime and don't erase it. They render him as a person rather than a cardboard villain. He lived inside contradictions he created and managed. There were also the myths he outlived in print. The image of a rooftop shooter in a television series. The claim that he was a roaring tyrant who loved display. The idea that he personally ordered every dramatic act anyone later tried to assign to him. The reliable documents paint a different frame. He was a manager, a coordinator, a man whose influence derived from steadiness more than from loud threats. He was present at the building of a machine that bent markets. He agreed to and benefited from crimes that relied on fear and on the slow erosion of civic trust. He worked at making the unlawful look routine. His daily habits told you how he thought. He rose early, shaved carefully, chose clothes that blended rather than shouted. He picked the same seat in certain restaurants because he liked the angle to the door. He timed conversations. He disliked roaming talk. He liked conclusions. He did not gamble in rooms he didn't control. He sent holiday envelopes that were generous without being conspicuous. He made his calls from payphones before that. Felt old-fashioned. He kept a tight list of people who could reach him, and kept it shorter each year. His way with subordinates rested on predictability. He gave an assignment, and expected it to be finished on schedule. He did not prefer men who bragged. He kept the excitable useful by giving them tasks that burned energy without burning the building. He rewarded consistency more than imagination. He moved people aside quietly when they became a liability. He did not explain such moves twice. That kind of leadership can look cold. It also kept the outfit from eating itself as other groups did. Lawmen who chased him learned the same pattern from another angle. The most successful among them followed paper and patience. The tax case that pinned him down in 1931 did not need a confession or a dramatic raid. It needed what a treasury agent once called good arithmetic. The film union case that broke the coastal pipeline did not need a chase through alleys. It needed a witness with receipts and a clean story. He would have understood, with a grim smile, why those were the tactics that worked. He had believed in arithmetic his whole life. In the years after his death, his name lingered in the margins of reports about other men. When Ricca's parole kept him formally quiet, when Accardo preferred to advise more than appear, when Humphrey's skill with labor smoothed out edges that once drew headlines, when new faces rose and fell. Nitti's role was invoked as a kind of shorthand for the era that turned brass-knuckle outfits into suits and ledgers enterprises. Scholars and reporters reached for him to explain that shift because he embodied it so neatly. He had crossed from barrel-dodging nights to conference room afternoons without changing his tone. He is buried among others whose names shaped the city's rough chapters. The cemetery where he rests has a hush that doesn't care about newspaper clips. Visitors sometimes look for famous stones. Locals pass without a glance, used to the history around them. That quiet fits him. He had lived in a way that made big cities work without stopping, patching gaps with bribes and pressure, making timetables run. He had also helped keep harmful systems alive by profiting from those gaps. His life contains both truths and forces you to see them together. If you want to hold him in one image, pick neither the headline nor the rumor. Picture instead a man in a neat suit at a small table, a cup of coffee cooling, a list of names folded once in his pocket, an appointment book with slots measured in minutes, a steady nod when a report satisfies him, a shorter, colder nod when it does not. Picture him leaving on time, not rushing, not lingering, careful with the door, scanning the street without looking like he is scanning. That was Frank Nitti. A set of habits, a chain of choices, a record you can read in court files and memories. A manager of the unlawful, who believed that order could disguise almost anything, until the day order could not shield him from the one thing he feared more than failure. Years after he was gone, the city still moved in patterns he had helped set. The rush of trains at dawn, the clatter of dishes in corner diners, the steady shuffle of clerks and drivers, Chicago kept its tempo. In offices that never had signs on the door, men carried forward the idea he had favored. Keep power divided, keep the cash plain, keep the noise down. To strangers, his name slowly became a fragment from old headlines. To the people who had sat with him and learned the value of a quiet plan, his absence felt like a chair that stayed empty but still shaped the conversation. The federal cases that had frightened him did their work. The film business cleaned house in public. Unions rewrote bylaws. Studios built new procedures to lower the chance that one office could freeze production. Some reforms were sincere, some were theater. Either way, the coast learned that envelopes sent east were not a private cost. They were a national story, once agents opened bank files and persuaders became witnesses. Hollywood did not forget. Neither did Chicago. The outfit tightened the lines that touched labor, moved middlemen farther from the center, and treated every check stub as a potential exhibit. That was not piety. It was survival. People tried to measure how much of the later era ran on his rules. You could see traces in the way Accardo hardened the preference for back-office power, and in Ricca's insistence on routines that outlived any single person's style. The men who rose after them inherited an organization that looked less like a street gang and more like a low-profile holding company with illegal income streams. Gambling in storefronts that looked like lunchrooms, coin routes that worked like vending firms, contract advisors who never raised their voice. That posture felt familiar because he had lived it before it became doctrine. The coastal piece of the story had an epilogue of its own. The courier who cut a deal to shorten his sentence left prison and tried to vanish in the desert light of the Southwest. He took a new name and a job in a respectable business. Years later, a bomb took his life outside his home. Papers reminded readers he had once been a star witness in the film labor case. No court tied his death to any single person, but the moral landed on its own. The choices he made in the glare of a courtroom traveled with him. The union leader who had shared the dock with him served time, left custody, and died a few years later far from the lights of a studio lot. The case that had once been whispered about in commissaries and screening rooms became a permanent chapter in the city's memory and in labor's rulebook. Back home, the outfit's control of information through the race wire drew heat. Competing services fought for the right to feed results into bookmaking rooms. One prominent operator tried to bring the story to federal attention, then suffered an attack and later died. Investigators gathered names and rumors. The lesson was not subtle. Information had become a commodity like liquor had been, and whoever owned the pipeline set the terms. That view of the world controlled the flow. Not just the product was one he had understood from the first days he mapped bootlegging routes. His influence lived on in the way the city's shadow economy thought about timing. Public interest in organized crime changed shape in the 1950s. Television brought hearings into living rooms. Senators asked questions under bright lamps, and witnesses squirmed. The terms syndicate and outfit migrated from insider slang into the language of the nightly news. Faces from Chicago appeared for a day and vanished again. His name surfaced as a reference point when staff councils explained the shift from gunmen to accountants, from brash talkers to careful managers. That description fit him better than the swaggering depictions that soon flooded fiction. Entertainment reached back and pulled him into new stories. A popular series about federal agents recast him as a recurring, heavy, dramatic, and theatrical, often more visible than he had ever been in real life. Later films gave him scenes that never happened, and lines he never said. In one movie, he was thrown from a roof. In another, he directed mayhem with an almost operatic flair. People who lived through the years shook their heads. The truth was less cinematic. He disliked spectacle. He preferred a suit that didn't attract a glance, a table in a corner, and a meeting that ended 5 minutes early. The gap between the man and the myth says more about what audiences want than about how he worked. That work had always depended on his ability to make the unlawful feel routine. He turned bootlegging into a schedule. He turned labor pressure into a calendar of dues and advice payments. He turned bribery into a line item. He learned early how to sell calm to people who were afraid of interruptions, whether they ran a speakeasy, a factory, or a studio. Calm had a price. He collected it. The crimes are not softer because they wore business clothes. People paid who should not have had to pay. Workers lost who should have been represented fairly. The public trust frayed when envelopes replaced rules. Those outcomes lasted after he was gone, like grooves worn into a table. His personal life settled into silence. Family kept photographs in drawers, not on mantels. They treated curious questions with polite shrugs. Neighbors who remembered the man with the neat yard told their children simple things. He was quiet, he was tidy, he walked with purpose. The widow and close kin did not live like royalty. They lived like people in a city where names can be a burden. If grief pushed them inward, the city let them be. Chicago has a way of absorbing stories and giving their characters room to fade. If you look for proof of his style in surviving papers, you find traces that match the memories. Receipts from restaurants where the check amounts never imply a party. Hotel registers with short stays, never longer than a night or two. Phone logs that show calls made from booths instead of home lines. Returns filed with numbers that look modest beside the life of a man who ate in the same few places and lived in a solid but not spectacular house. The details are small. Together they draw an outline that matches the man described by people who said he valued control over display. He had never been a policy thinker in the way Ricca was, nor a strategist of the future the way Accardo proved to be, nor a natural political broker like Guzik, nor a smooth-talking labor expert like Humphreys. He was the binder that held those pages together. He translated plans into practice and kept money on time. He believed that most problems could be solved by putting the right person in the right chair and giving him a simple instruction. That method worked until papers with seals appeared and witnesses started to fill in the blanks. The tax case that first pulled him into federal custody taught him how the government had learned to fight. He never forgot that ledgers could be more dangerous than gunfire. He had avoided elaborate fronts, favored simple shells, and kept signatures light. Even then, the math betrayed him once. It threatened to do so again when the Hollywood case gathered speed. His last act was a refusal to live through another term. That choice emerged from a mind that had long sought to guard itself from confinement. It was not noble. It was human and tragic. Listeners sometimes want to know if he had a line he would not cross. The record suggests his single hard limit was the one the walls had taught him. He did not relish violence, but he was willing to benefit from an enterprise that used it when persuasion failed. He disliked cheats inside his own camp, but he tolerated them if they delivered and could be watched. He did not pursue revenge for its own sake. He pursued order. He wanted meetings to start on time and end before the last cup of coffee cooled. If there was a moral center in him beyond loyalty to his circle and care for family, it does not appear in the files. There are side stories that cling to his name because the era attracts them. The rumor that the attack on a Chicago mayor in Florida had really been meant for the famous boss keeps returning. Evidence points to a lone attacker, not a plot by the outfit, and historians have found no solid tie to Nitti. The whisper that he personally planned the worst of the late 20s bloodshed overshoots what credible sources show. He rode high in a network that used force when it wanted leverage. He did not chase scenes that risked the very quiet he prized. His burial place is a patch of ground, visited by curiosity more than by ceremony. People leave coins, sometimes, the way visitors do when they want to mark a stop without making a speech. The stone sits among other names that marked a century of loud headlines. The cemetery trees do what trees do. They shade the past without comment. That belongs to the story too. He had made a living shaping events without applause. A quiet resting place suits a man who valued the sound of a door closing gently behind him. Every so often, a new document slips into public view, and writers revise a footnote. A letter surfaces, an agent's memo is unsealed, a deposition shows a date that pushes a small event forward or back. None of those changes alter the central picture. He was an immigrant who learned how Chicago worked, chose a path outside the law, and made that path look like business. He thrived in systems that rewarded reliability over bravado. He applied pressure to institutions that should have served the public, and made them serve his circle instead. He escaped prison once, faced it again, and could not face it twice. If there is a lesson in the way he ran things, it is this. Routine can hide harm as effectively as any mask. People who resent chaos will pay for calm, even when calm is enforced by fear. He understood that trade, and built a life on it. The public only noticed when someone tripped a wire, a witness spoke, or an audit placed two figures side by side. By then, the money had moved, and the habit had taken hold. That was his craft. That was the damage. In the months after he died, friends repeated a quiet line he had, used when a plan impressed him. He would nod once and say, "That will do." It was not praise so much as permission to continue. Chicago, in its way, said the same about the system he helped mature. It went on. People adjusted their roles. New faces took old chairs. Some went to prison and came back to smaller desks. Some retired without ever appearing on a front page. The engine kept humming because it had been built to outlast any one set of hands. Think of him now not as a legend, but as a worker who rose to run a complicated, unlawful shop. He measured days by completed tasks. He kept his circle tight. He hid in plain sight. He smiled rarely and remembered when rent was due. He was polite on porches and relentless in offices. He did not dream beyond the next arrangement. He believed he could plan his way out of risk. For a long time, that belief held. Then paper followed paper. A witness found a voice, and fear he could not manage closed in. His story is a thread in Chicago's larger fabric. Pull it and you find docks, ward offices, union halls, studios, courtrooms, and a small house where the porch light was never left on for very long. If you stand on a bridge in Chicago before sunrise and watch the river slide under you, it's easy to imagine the city as he knew it: practical, impatient, always moving. He would have liked the hour when trucks roll, and most people are still inside, when deals feel possible because the day hasn't had time to say no. He built his life inside that mood. He trusted clocks. He trusted lists. He trusted the idea that a person who shows up, listens closely, and keeps his temper can bend a room without raising his voice. Long after he was gone, the people who had studied him for a living tried to fit him into categories that were too simple. Some called him a ruthless boss, which misses the way power worked in his circle. Others called him a harmless clerk, which ignores the harm done by a system he helped run. The record settles between those poles. He was a manager of crime, a builder of routines that turned illegal trade into a schedule. He made sure liquor reached hidden bars in the 1920s, cash reached ledgers in the 1930s, and influence reached union offices across industries. He preferred offices to alleys, but the results touched both. Started angry, because the beginning matters. A southern Italian town with small fields and tight streets produced a child who learned restraint early. When his family reached New York in the 1890s, he found work wherever it sat, sweeping, carrying, then barbering. The chair taught him more than a trade. It taught him how neighborhoods breathe, who pays on time, who owes 3 weeks, which block captain can fix a permit problem, which patrolman smiles when an envelope appears. That knowledge shaped his path when he moved to Chicago, rented a chair, and made himself useful to people who needed a steady hand. Those first police notes with his name speak of small trouble, petty theft, suspicion of handling stolen jewelry, a weapon charge. The cases did not build a legend, they built a pattern. He was learning where the borders sat and how to approach them without setting off alarms. He kept a clean apron and a neat desk. He listened when older men talked about how the city balanced law and arrangement. When prohibition barreled in, he didn't change character. He scaled up the habits that had already paid. Design a route. Choose reliable people. Deliver on time. Keep calm when the unexpected happens. Bootlegging in Chicago wasn't a wild dash for most of the decade. It was logistics. Boats came across the lake or downriver. Warehouses received the stock. Drivers rotated routes. Call sheets told speakeasies when to expect delivery. He helped build that grid. Bribery greased it. Bribes were crimes in their own right, cash that turned public duty into private service. He treated them as costs the way a legal business treats rent. That cold view is part of why the system lasted. Treating wrongdoing like paperwork makes it harder to uproot. The public saw explosions and headlines. He saw calendars and totals. He avoided rooms where the loudest men shouted their plans. He preferred sit-downs where territory and percentages were parceled out in even voices. Violence remained in the toolbox of the era, but his contribution was less about the loud moment and more about the discipline that kept the machine running between loud moments. The outfit grew rich because schedules held. He made schedules hold. The government's learning curve finally caught up to that kind of discipline. When agents started to follow money instead of trucks, the shape of the fight changed. In 1931, he pleaded guilty to federal tax charges tied to income that could not be explained on paper. He served time and came out thinner, older in the eyes, and unable to shake the feeling that walls were always nearby. Friends called it a fear of closed spaces, but it was bigger than any label. It was a daily pressure that influenced every step he took afterward. The shooting inside the detective bureau in late 1932 made the pressure heavier. He walked into a room called by the law and left with wounds that evidence later suggested did not come from any gun he drew. The big accusation against him faltered. The incident made him disbelieve safe rooms. From then on, meetings shortened, exits mattered more, and he picked his routes as if they were chess moves. He resumed his role not because he forgot what had happened, but because he could not imagine doing anything else. Repeal in 1933 dried up the biggest cash river. Under his steady hand and the guidance of men around him who preferred plans to headlines, the outfit moved into gambling, vending routes, and labor influence. The language on the page was bland committees, contracts, dues. The practice behind that language was not bland at all. Union offices that controlled job lists and grievances became levers. Employers who feared delays paid for quiet. Those payments, whether labeled as funds or advice, traveled through fronts and couriers and returned to Chicago like water pumped back uphill. The crimes in this phase were clear: extortion, conspiracy, bribery, and the tax games that tried to clean the trail. Hollywood was simply that model on a brighter stage. Through allies and IATs, the outfit reached studios that could not afford a silent lot. A union president from Chicago and his fast-talking fixer sold peace in exchange for money that moved east. For several years, the system worked because it served everyone at the table until it didn't. Investigators followed checks through banks, put witnesses under oath, and laid out a story that a jury could understand. Convictions fell. Deals to cooperate followed. His name surfaced with others in papers stamped with federal seals. He saw the path leading back to a place he could not tolerate. He chose not to walk it again. His last morning left behind a set of notes and the quiet of a suburb that did not want a crowd. The rail lines near his neighborhood had always been a comfort to him. Trains ran on schedules that matched his belief in order. He ended his life near those tracks. The city felt the shock and then fell back into its routine the way cities do. Inside the outfit, the board rebalanced. The men who had always preferred privacy took even more of it. Policies he had lived by became rules. Divide authority, avoid gaudy fronts, keep records dull, and let lawyers absorb the light. People who try to measure him by comparison to louder figures miss the point. He wasn't a myth maker. He didn't swagger. He collected. He counted. He kept people in their lanes. He could be hard, but he hated noise. If a shop owner balked, someone down the line reminded him what it would cost. If a union vote needed a nudge, the nudge happened out of view. He sat above that level and expected reports that were crisp and accurate. That distance served legal strategy and personality both. He also had a home. Family tried to keep it separate from everything else. They kept holidays modest. They protected privacy. Neighbors remembered manners. A nod. A tip. A man who didn't linger on the sidewalk. Those memories complicate the picture without changing it. Politeness at a porch rail sits next to extortion run like a business. The contradiction is real, and you don't resolve it by wishing it away. You hold both facts and understand that people who make the world worse often look ordinary. His crimes are not in dispute when you strip away gossip. He took part in the illegal liquor trade during Prohibition, organized routes and storage, and paid bribes to defeat law enforcement. He committed tax evasion and accepted a federal sentence. He helped turn unions into instruments for pressure that earned money for his circle at the expense of workers and employers alike. He joined a scheme that extracted payments from film studios and sent that money home. He participated in a structure that relied on the threat of force, even when he wasn't the one delivering the threat. Those are the acts that show up in indictments, pleas, and histories that diagram how the outfit worked. What he did not do is also worth saying aloud. He did not thrive on theater. He did not talk to cameras. He did not call himself a king. He did not hunt opportunities to stand at the center of public violence. He avoided extremes because extremes shorten careers. He wanted the kind of power that looks like organization, not chaos. That choice helped him live as long as he did in a trade that burns people fast. It also meant that when the end came, it came without a scene, a private decision in a quiet place. After his death, law enforcement took lessons from the years they had chased him. Investigators built careers not on raids, but on arithmetic and patience. Grand juries learned to look for patterns, not confessions. The city read the room too. Politicians grew more careful about which hands they shook in front of cameras. Newspapers kept digging through records, instead of waiting for raids to photograph. Union reformers learned to harden their books, limit the power of any one office, and question anyone who arrived with generous promises and thin titles. Popular culture kept reshaping him. A television series in the 1950s turned him into a symbol who shouted when the real man rarely raised his voice. Films decades later staged rooftop drama, no court file supports. The audience loved it. The archivists sighed. The true story is not less gripping for being quieter. It shows how harmful systems thrive when clothed in routine, how stable calendars can hide unlawful pressure, how a city can live with corruption so long that people call it tradition. Historians, when pressed about sources, point to court transcripts, IRS files, city directories, police logs, and the testimony that came when frightened men chose lesser penalties over silence. They warn that the inner circle left few written records. They remind readers that much of what we know about conversations in back rooms comes from witnesses who had motives. Yet the broad outline holds across versions and decades. A boy from Angry became a Chicago businessman in everything but law. He rose because he made things run. He lasted because he preferred method to drama. He fell because paper taught the law a new way to fight, and because an old fear left him no acceptable path. Think about what his story says beyond him. It says demand creates markets no statute can erase by itself. It says discipline can serve good or ill with equal efficiency. It says people will pay for calm even when calm is enforced by quiet threat. It says a city can absorb almost anything if it is delivered without noise. And it says that one person's private dread can end a life even when that person looks, from the sidewalk, perfectly composed. He walks through this narrative without speeches because he walked through his years that way. He made appointments, kept them, and left early. He relied on habits so fixed that friends could set their watches by him. He rewarded people who mimicked that steadiness and moved away from those who needed chaos to feel alive. He believed every problem could be broken into tasks and assigned. For a long time, that belief produced results. It also created blind spots you could drive a truck through once a witness started naming names. If you want a last image that feels true, picture a small table near a window in a quiet restaurant. A man in a good suit sits with his back not fully to the door. His hat rests on the chair beside him. In front of him are a coffee, a folded list, a telegram about a union vote in another city, and a short stack of bills for an errand he doesn't want to leave to someone else. He checks his watch, nods once at something only he understands, and stands. He leaves a tip. He steps into daylight that makes no promises. That's the man as he was. Efficient, contained, and convinced that order is the only shield that matters. Chicago outlived him, as it has outlived many such figures, by swallowing the story and carrying on. Bridges still rise for freighters. Evening trains still lace the edges of neighborhoods where families sit down to dinner. In those ordinary scenes, the echo of his method survives. Keep steady, make schedules, avoid the spotlight. The city will keep producing people who use those skills for good and for harm. His name endures as a reminder of what the harm looks like when it wears a tidy suit and keeps a small calendar in a breast pocket. His grave sits under Midwest sky, plain and still. The stone doesn't tell the story. The story lives in ledgers and in the memory of a town that learned, the hard way, how patient crime can be when it calls itself business. Walk away from that stone and the wind off the prairie smells like new weather. That too fits. He built a life on reading the weather, and for years, he was right. In the end, another forecast arrived. Paper, witnesses, courts, and his craft could not match it. What remains is the caution his years provide. Routine is not innocence, calm is not kindness, and a quiet room can still hold a wrong that shapes a city for a generation. And that was the story of Frank Nitti, a man whose empire rose in the shadows and faded into history's quiet corners. As the night settles deeper, let his tale drift away like smoke in the wind. Thank you for joining me tonight. Don't forget to share your city and time in the comments. And if you haven't yet, subscribe so you never miss another story from the silent empires. Sleep well, dream easy, and good night.